We are definitely trying to say to, the G77 or the Global South, or however else you want to refer to them, that this is not a club that we see you on the outside of. This is a club that we, in fact, hope we're going to build with you.
It's the Lawfare podcast. I'm Eugenia Loftre, Lawfare's Fellow in Technology Policy and Law, with Adam Segal, Senior Advisor in the Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy.
It's comprehensive, and there hasn't been, a publicly international strategy like this in a while. And, clearly the importance of bringing this as a foreign policy issue is pretty high in my mind.
Today, we're talking about the recently released U.S. International Cyberspace and Digital Policy Strategy. Adam, a few days ago, the State Department unveiled the new International Cyberspace and Digital Policy Strategy. And this is just one new document to add to what's already a pretty impressive collection of actions that have been taken in the past year and a half by the administration on cyber and digital issues. And this was all kind of kickstarted in a way by the National Cybersecurity Strategy that was released in March of last year. So maybe could you start by walking us through what the rationale behind the need for a separate international strategy is, so that we can understand how it fits and complements the other initiatives that we've seen from the administration?
Yeah, great. And thanks for having me on and giving me this opportunity to talk about the strategy. So the strategy really sits kind of below, as you said, a set of other strategies and documents that the administration has put out. First, the strategy is required by the 2023 NDA, the National Defense Authorization Act. It says that the Secretary needs to release an international strategy for cyber and digital policy. And as you mentioned, the National Cybersecurity Strategy had 5 pillars, and the 5th pillar was international engagement. And so the strategy is picking up on that 5th pillar and really pulling it out and kind of describing in more detail about what the U.S. will do internationally. And also, as you mentioned, we also refer to the National Security Strategy. So the National Security Strategy talks about the importance of an open, global, rules-based world, and the cyber strategy is definitely part of that as well.
Now, you have been intimately involved in the development of this strategy. So before we dive into the substance, I'm actually kind of interested in getting maybe a little bit of a sneak peek behind the curtain. So maybe can you tell us a little bit about what the experience of being involved in the strategy, in developing the strategy was like? Was there anything about the process that you were surprised by or that was new to you?
Sure. Well, it was all new to me. In some ways, all surprising. This is my first experience in the U.S. government. I've been in the think tank world for a little bit over 20 years, and Ambassador Fick asked me to come in and help write the strategy. So I was really starting with a very much clean slate. I had not been involved in previous strategies or policy making. The process was essentially I read every previous U.S. government strategy on cyber and looked at all the international components. I read every other country's international strategy that they had just put out. Australia had put a new strategy out. The Germans had put a new strategy out. So I kind of wanted to get a sense of how they were organized. And then in my first 3 months of the job, I essentially kind of worked my way out. So I started in the bureau. So at that time, the bureau was about a year old, the Cyber and Digital Bureau, and we are organized along 3 kind of main verticals. So kind of cybersecurity and the norms of state behavior, international communication policy, so looking at a lot of the tech and the infrastructure, and then digital freedom, so a lot of the human rights issues. And I spoke to the heads of those 3 verticals, and then people working for them, asked them what they're working on, what their priorities were, what we do well, what we could be doing better, what type of issues, and then who they work within the department. So of course, even though CDP was set up to coordinate across these issues, there's still parts of these issues that are worked in other parts of the State Department, in INL, in DRL, in arms control. Talked to those people, kind of had the same set of conversations. And then I asked people, well, who do you talk to in other parts of the U.S. government? Well, who are your interagency contacts? Went out to them, had all of those conversations. Again, what are you doing? What do you do with the State Department? What your priorities are? Sat on that for about a month, kind of tried to consolidate that. Then did a series of conversations with people that I knew from my think tank life, so in civil society and academics. Did a draft, and then we did some outreach to the three communities in December. So kind of the think tank community, the civil society community, and the private sector. In January, did two more sets of meetings like that, and did something meetings in California, and then did another draft and circulated that, another draft. I don't probably understating the number of drafts there. And then we did some table reads in March, and then we started the interagency process. And here we are a week later, a week on Monday with the release.
Well, it sounds like 20 years in the think tank world prepared you perfectly for this kind of process, though.
That I think I had worked with Ambassador Fick on a task force report 3 years ago, and the role that I played in those task forces, which is the fourth task force I had done at CFR, is really consolidating other people's thinking and trying to create a consensus document. And I've had experience with other people editing my work as a task force director, although the scale of it at the U.S. government was not something that I was quite prepared for.
I can't even imagine. Now, moving on to the actual content of the strategy. As I was reading it, I guess the main new thing in a way is this concept of digital solidarity that spans across. We at Lawfare were very happy to see this attributed to our contributor, Paula Chavez. But I actually am going to need you to help me settle a debate here, because we were talking about the strategy yesterday in our other podcast, Rational Security, and we had a fairly interesting range of interpretations about what the principle of digital solidarity actually entails and what it demonstrates. So would you say that digital solidarity is more about focusing on working and collaborating with those allies and partners that already kind of buy or are aligned to the American value system, and kind of saying, like, we recognize that this is not going to be everyone's vision, and so we're just excluding you in a way? Or is this about, in a way, strengthening a common position to ensure that the more authoritarian leaning vision of what the internet could look like doesn't take hold? If those, that was kind of a range of understandings that we had.
Well, one, I have to listen to the podcast because I didn't hear it yesterday. I would say it's probably closer to the latter than the former, right? I think I was very conscious in the paragraphs where we kind of describe the actions that make up digital solidarity, of not using the language of like-minded, right? This is not an alliance. It's not a T12 or a D12, or however how you want to frame it. There is a lot of focus, of course, on rights respecting use of technology, which is going to put us in opposition to how the authoritarian states use technology. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But we are definitely trying to say to the G77 or the Global South, or however else you want to refer to them, that this is not a club that we see you on the outside of. This is a club that we, in fact, hope we're going to build with you. So I think a big part of the digital solidarity messaging is around mutual support and assistance and capacity building, and helping countries achieve their goals. And so it is more about building coalitions than defining the ones we already have. Now, again, of course, we're going to work closely with our partners that and the like-minded around the values, but I think it's closer to the latter than the former.
Well, thank you for helping settle that. No, I do think it's quite interesting when I look at the list of qualifiers for the affirmative vision of the internet, and I saw that there are some significant, maybe not significant, but there are some differences between the way that the national cybersecurity strategy talks about it and the way that the international strategy, right? And in particular, I'm thinking about there's a shift from the open, free, global, interoperable, reliable, secure to open, interoperable, secure, and reliable. So we seem to drop free and global. Why?
Yeah, I mean, so part of this, to be quite honest, is the process of drafting this thing. And, one of the things that happens is that every agency and every bureau wants to add a new qualifier or adjective into every description. And so, to some extent, I don't know how much to read into policy on those specific things. I think global probably there was some sense of we are recognizing that fragmentation is happening and that there will be some differentiation about how the internet and the digital ecosystem relate to each other between values respecting and rights respecting and those that are under authoritarian. But I think in other places we do, we are trying to talk about that as being as broad and as global as possible. And so, the affirmative vision, I think, in other places extends to that as well.
What about free?
Free, I think, also is a value that is discussed in other places of the strategy, if I remember correctly. And so that affirmative vision, the language in that first principle high up in the strategy, is one that has, I think, been widely kind of described and discussed amongst various agencies. And so I think it reflects all those concerns.
So I really enjoyed when I was reading the strategy that there was maybe for the first time, if I recall correctly, although I may be forgetting about some other document, but there was, I better understood what this American proposition was, what the affirmative vision, contrasted to the digital authoritarianism was, because we've been maybe talking for some years about what the misuse or the irresponsible position looks like. And I've always wondered, like, okay, but how are we defining it in the positive? So I really enjoyed seeing that maybe a little bit more clearly. I think that comes through. And you do offer basically two narratives of this is what it can look like, right? You have the vision of digital solidarity and you have a vision of digital sovereignty. Can you tell us, what do those two internets look like in practical terms? Like, if in X amount of years I log on to my digital solidarity based internet, how is it different from my digital sovereignty internet?
Well, I mean, I'm glad that came through, and I think that was a major message that we were trying to send. I think with these types of documents, there is a tendency, and again, by law, we actually had to spend a quite amount of time on the threat, describing the threat, and so then the document often takes the tone of this is what we're against, and as opposed to what we are proposing and how we see the future should develop. And I think you'll see that being further developed. We reference in the strategy that USAID's digital policy is coming out soon, and so they will, I think, also be very clear on kind of the what we used to call the wonders of the internet, right? All the benefits that will come from it. Look, I think it's very hard to say in a short kind of bumper sticker. Interoperable, free. That is the short bumper sticker that we used to use. But I think if you can start putting it together with a whole range of discussions that we're having about mass surveillance and the misuse of commercial spyware, fighting, online gender-based violence and information integrity, trusted vendors. So I think there's kind of a whole range of things that you can kind of piece together of how we think this space will look like. The shorthand is as you said, the kind of bumper sticker of rights respecting and interoperable, as inclusive as possible, serving people's political and economic interests and those things. But I think you can kind of, as I said, look at a range of the executive orders and those things and get a better sense of what we think is important.
So, since you do spend some time on it, and for anyone who has not had the opportunity to go read the strategy yet, tell us a little bit more about what the threat is. What is this negative vision?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is, right. Of course, there's the range of state actors that's not going to be a big surprise to anyone who tunes into Lawfare. So, a range of U.S. government officials have talked about China as being the pacing threat and the most persistent cyber threat. There's Russia, and of course, its actions in Ukraine and elsewhere. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to describe Iran and North Korea as rising threats any longer. They've already arrived. They are in developing new capacities. We talk a lot about some backsliding in liberal and illiberal states and the misuse of commercial spyware, as well as online harassment and need for privacy and other rights respecting protections, internet shutdowns and takedowns, as well as just concerns about AI, and that there's just issues about, again, inclusivity and how widely dispersed the benefits are going to be, ensuring that we are focused on the benefits as at the same time as we're encouraging innovation, and making sure that we are working with the private sector on not making some of the mistakes we made with the first wave of digitization, and that we are talking about transparency and accountability at the beginning, not while the product's already out.
So you mentioned the backsliding, and I'm glad you brought that up because I have to admit that as a non-American, I sometimes struggle with the articulation of these narratives when I see them in policy, because it usually sounds a little bit like there's the good guys and there's the bad guys, and it's sometimes it can come across as a little bit simplistic. And when we look at something like what the findings from the PEGA committee, which found that some EU member states were abusing commercial spyware, the distinction between the two camps, between the good guys and the bad guys, can be like, well, is it really so? Like, it all becomes a little bit murkier, right? So how do you think about communicating the rights respecting approach to maybe middle countries or the global south, or that, however you want to call it, that might be initially a little bit more skeptical that this is anything more than maybe just a facet of big power competition, especially considering so much attention is being paid right now to the relationship between the US and China?
Yeah, I think part of the problem, right, is I think we can now point to the principles, right, and you can say, the U.S. has issued an executive order on the misuse of commercial spyware. We now have this joint declaration. We're trying to bring as many countries into it as possible, and these are the values that we're going to hold ourselves up to. I think you're right that for others, smaller countries or those in the global south, they may either not see, may see some degree of hypocrisy, or the U.S. not holding up to those standards or refusing to call out some close allies, because I think the U.S. does raise those issues, but is very likely to do them behind closed doors, right? We're not, especially in the case, as you said, that if we have some allies that there's some close competition around some of the geopolitical and the strategic competition with China, it may be that some cases we may call them out publicly, but a lot of this probably happens in smaller meetings bilaterally, where we raise the issue and address our concerns about that, but it's not going to be visible to the rest of the world. And so then you do get into the question of like, are you calling out your friends? Is this all about China? I'm not privy to those meetings either, right? I write strategy. I don't go to most of those bilateral meetings, but speaking with Ambassador Fick and all the others who do this work, they talk about how they do raise it bilaterally, and so I think that's how the messaging happens.
A few months ago, I had a very interesting conversation with Villalani Gilly on the Lawfare podcast, talking about some of the drivers for adoption of Chinese technology in Africa, right? And I bring that conversation up because I thought it articulated really well kind of the other side, which is, okay, why are some countries choosing these providers? What are their options as they see them? What are they prioritizing? Part of the challenge when it comes to these two visions is the value proposition. Because if we just stick with, well, this is rights respecting, but the other side is, well, this is cheap and actually going to help you, bridge the digital divide and, or, control your internal security or whatever the need is, you can kind of understand why anyone would go one way over the other. So when the strategy talks about demonstrating the advantages of digital solidarity as a principle, how does this come into play? What are those maybe concrete advantages that you can put forth that would maybe sway an official trying to make a determination about which provider to choose one way instead of the other?
Yeah, I think there's two things. One is I think U.S. government officials have been arguing for a long time that there's upfront costs and there's long-term costs, and so even if you get the Huawei product cheap at the beginning, there are still longer-term costs, and eventually a lot of these countries start becoming more sensitive to the security concerns as they go along, and then you have to figure out what you're going to do about having those products in your networks. I think the best example right now we have is Costa Rica, right? So Costa Rica gets hammered with this Conti ransomware. Costa Rican critical infrastructure, government services are shut down. The U.S. helps provide some assistance, $25 million, helps set up a SOC, a security operations center, and really helps on the incident response there, right? That's a great example of kind of digital solidarity being really concretely implemented. And then the Costa Rican government starts reconsidering its use of Huawei and ZTE and other trusted vendors and starts talking to other regional partners about that. So you get a kind of secondary effect that, from the U.S. perspective, policy implication is important. And then Intel and others start thinking about reshoring some supply chain to Costa Rica because of the larger ecosystems. I think that is a value proposition that we really want to share. $25 million is not a huge investment compared, especially to the digital Silk Road or what the Chinese have. But for the department, for the bureau, it was a huge amount, right? It was much more than we have. The strategy talks about the new fund, the cyber and digital technology related fund. That's $50 million. So the bureau and the department are looking for those types of projects where we think we can have second and third order effects. And we're going to hope to grow that fund. But I think those are the kind of types of messages that we're going to hope to send, that we're never going to compete on scale, which is a problem, but we also have partners, right? A lot of this is happening with through AUKUS and through the TTC and the EU and working together in third countries, and that I think is the message.
I mean, I'm glad you brought up the case of Costa Rica, because that's a case that I've particularly looked at and written about, and I've been thinking about the different ways in which mechanisms for cyber assistance can be structured. So you mentioned the fund already, but of course, that runs into the problem of scaling. So what are the other ways? What are some of the other lines of effort that can be brought into action?
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason why the fund was created was because we realized that we needed to broaden the aperture, right? That there's just when you look at capacity building, right? There's a whole range of issues, short term, long term, and the department, had historically been really good at the longer term. A lot of it was, face to face and developing human capital, training diplomats, for example, on the norms from the group of government experts, or you need a national cyber strategy written, we can help you do that. Some training courses, and those things are excellent, right? But they're longer term things. You're talking about hopefully we'll be interacting with these people for decades. But Costa Rica and Albania, as well as Ukraine, really hammered home the need for immediate response, right? An incident response, and how do you help on that side? So I think we're focusing this. We're opening the aperture so it includes everything from longer term to immediately after the boom to before the boom, and a lot of that is, the scale is only sustainable if we find other partners. And so in the Pacific Islands, Australia is doing a huge amount of that lifting, right, and does the training, but it's also the private sector, right. The reason why the strategy spends a good section talking about the reliance on the private sector is because there's no way the department can do it alone, and so there's a lot of thinking about how we can make sure that we can sustain and learn the lessons of Ukraine and Albania and Costa Rica and what the role the private sector has played for the next scenario.
Speaking of the role that the private sector can play and should play, how did you find the engagement from that side? Because we know that public-private partnerships have been a cornerstone in the domestic space, but I've sometimes heard some skepticism maybe from the private sector about, it's all like, well, the UN will UN, and like, what's the point? Have you seen an increase in, interest in what is going on in terms of international policy? And let me just weave in this question as well. This also runs into the challenge that sometimes for some of these conversations, for as much as the private sector might want to participate, they will be vetoed from participating by other countries. So how do you navigate that tension of being able to communicate this is worth your time and attention with the fact that sometimes they might not be welcome into the room?
Yeah, the question has kind of two angles. I think one is that the strategy reinforces that multi stakeholderism and the process of involving the private sector and civil society and the academic community is one of the great strengths of the U.S. system. One that we hope that other countries see the strength of, and that we promote as a strength, and that we promote multi stakeholderism in the institutions that support it, and we will continue doing that. And is really an important part of the department's role is to make sure that civil society and the private sector is heard, and we know the Russians and the Chinese and others are trying to squeeze that space and limit, and we're going to continue pushing back on that. I think the response we've received most widely is not an enthusiasm problem or a skepticism. It's more of a information knowledge problem, right? Where do we plug in? How do we get involved, or how do we support, or who do we talk to? And so, for example, the ambassador was on a panel at RSA about the Tallinn mechanism, which is an effort to coordinate between the donors and the private sector and Ukraine about what Ukraine's needs are, and how who's the best country or private sector actor to respond to that. And I think a lot of companies just sort of like, well, we'd like to be involved in that. How would we do that? And to some extent, that's literally like giving out an email address. But in other cases, it's more complicated, and of course, procurement and contracting, and we on the state side, there's still some uncertainty, right? With the new fund, are we going to have some companies on retainer? Are we going to do, I think right now the idea is to do a couple pilot projects and see what works. But that is all being figured out, and I think that's what I've heard mostly is like, this sounds great. We just don't really know how to plug it.
Well, that's an improvement, to be honest. That's good. Now, going back to the types of actions that you could implement, left of boom, part of the strategy, and I think this is action area number one, is more about the infrastructure and building and promoting and supporting resilient, trusted infrastructure. I don't know that there's a direct mention of country of origin there. I believe there isn't. But is that kind of what the strategy is talking about?
Well, country of origin gets complicated, right? Because a company can be headquartered in a country of origin where the definition of trusted, right, has to do about transparent processes and ways to address, if the government comes to you and asks for data, is there a legal system in place? But you could still have supply chain in countries that don't have those things. So I think the definition has more to do about those processes than it does country of origin. We're trying to capture both of those things, but there are certainly some countries of origin where that doesn't exist at home at all, and so those would be excluded from those discussions of trusted vendors.
That makes sense. And you mentioned RSA. You've been at RSA, I understand, this past week. So what is the feedback that you've been getting on the strategy now that it's been unveiled? Clearly there's been some interest from some actors in getting involved. What's the general vibe?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was pretty amazing, right? Monday, when the strategy came out, and Secretary Blinken, gave a keynote at RSA. He's the first sitting Secretary of State to do that, and it was really, I think, a signal about the importance of tech to the Secretary's foreign policy goals and the U.S.'s foreign policy goals. So I think it was pretty amazing to have that as the first day RSA. Like, Mayorkas has been here before, and of course, heads of NSA have been here before, and Jen Easterly is a rock star here, and all of that. But to have the foreign policy messaging leading off the first day, I think was really important and critical, and kind of a reflection of all of the hard work that Ambassador Fick and the Bureau has done to kind of elevate these issues. I think the response has been, as I said, generally positive on kind of how do we get involved. We are defining and kind of clarifying what digital solidarity means to people. I think we expected that, right? I think there is a certain tension in the digital solidarity being both a thing and a process. Like, here's the outcome, but also we show digital solidarity by doing these things. So people have come up to us and kind of asked similar questions that you've asked about, is it a club, or how do we join the club? It's I don't know how the final document is close to 50 pages, so people are also still working their way through it. And I
55
think,
in my PDF.
Yeah, that
yes.
was longer. At one point, it was a 30-page document. That was before the interagency. So, but we did add some images, so that added some space to it as well. But so I think people are still
classic think tank.
Yeah. still adjusting it. But I think generally overall the response has been pretty positive.
So I for one, am pretty excited about the elevation of international cybersecurity policy, as sometimes one finds themselves alone in their interest. So I'm quite excited to hear that. But I do have to ask, these actions are supposed to be prioritized, or it's supposed to be, undertaken, I think the strategy says, over the next 3 to 5 years. And this is an election year. So how do you think, or how are you thinking about kind of future proofing these initiatives to make sure that that timeline can be respected, considering the uncertainty about what's to come?
Look, if there's a new administration, they by law have to write another strategy. That's what the NDA says. But I think for the lines of action that we talk about, there's pretty broad bipartisan support for them. And Mike McCall put out a letter after the strategy came out and said, was pretty positive about it and said, the proof is going to be in the pudding and the actual implementation. So I think we touch on a lot of themes that no matter who is in office, a year and a half from now, they're gonna pick up on a lot of those themes. They may change the framing, and I think part of the importance of the messaging is because clearly foreign partners are going to start hedging about who's going to be in office. It's going to be kind of beholden on us to try to convince them that there's going to be some continuity no matter who's in office. But I think that a lot of the themes will resonate and have resonated. There's certainly strong bipartisan support for the bureau, and I suspect that will continue.
This week, not only did we get the strategy, but we also had a couple of documents released by the ONCD, one of them being the first kind of report on kind of the status quo, how things are going, what are some of the initiatives from 2023 on cybersecurity. I'm blanking on the actual name of the document right now, but many of the lines of effort articulated in the strategy have clearly already been part of what the Bureau has been doing over the past year and will continue to do. So as we look ahead, we're expecting an implementation plan, but what else? What comes next?
So there'll be an implementation framework. There won't be a plan in the sense of a publicly released plan in the sense of like the ONCD kind of having the metrics and all of those things. At the end there, the conclusion, I tried to kind of suggest what some short-term milestones would be. So, focused on set of technologies around cables in particular and data centers and cloud, the progress in the POA, so the plan of action on implementation of the norms around state behavior in the UN, expanding and bringing in more countries to the G7 Hiroshima principles, right? Because right now that's fairly narrowly focused. Those are, I think, probably the most likely, and then some concrete projects around the CDT, around the fund. Those are the most likely things I think we'll see in the short term. The problem with implementation in international strategy is that you don't control what all the other countries do, right? ONCD can tell us to do this thing in this time frame. We don't get to tell the other countries what to do. And it would be, there is a high degree of continuity. It would be, I think, quite surprising if we showed up with a strategy that said we're dropping all the things we did before and doing new things. But I think those the kind of the four that are highlighted are the most likely things we'll see in the short term. And in the particular, the kind of looking for 2 or 3 new pilot plans around the fund.
Now, I hope this question is not like asking you which of your kids is your favorite kid, but out of everything that's in the strategy, and honestly, it's very comprehensive. There's a lot of ground covered in the strategy. What are you personally most excited to see kind of come to fruition?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think part of my satisfaction is that we just brought it all together. Like as you said, is it's comprehensive, and there hasn't been a publicly international strategy like this in a while. And clearly the importance of bringing this as a foreign policy issue is pretty high in my mind. I personally, yeah, I don't know if I have a favorite. Like you said, I because I came from as an outsider, I hadn't worked, on any of the specific issues there. My own personal work from before, was focused around. I had done a lot of work on kind of norms issues and the GGE. So of course the POA stuff is familiar to me, but also had done a lot of work on competition with China and the tech stuff. So The fund itself is pretty interesting and exciting to me. So maybe those two are at the highlight of just, but that's from my own kind of personal background.
That makes sense. I'm
Yeah.
sorry to have made you choose.
That's all right. I have two
Yeah.
kids and I love them both the same.
That's good to know. Okay. So, I guess since you were on the outside looking in, I'm going to give you maybe the opportunity to ask yourself a question. If you were in my position, what would you ask yourself and then answer it? Kind of as a way to wrap the conversation, kind of your final thoughts, something that we haven't had the time to discuss, but you really wish we had.
To some extent, like people ask me how the experience has been, and I guess I wasn't, certainly wasn't surprised by the bureaucratic process and how it, massaged the document as it went through. I guess I have been most interested in the strategy as part of it is, the bureau is only 2 years old, and it was created to deal with this technology issue that's rapidly changing, and so and AI, ChatGPT is just kind of supercharged the whole AI discussion. So I have been kind of, and I'm not part of that discussion, and I don't work on the AI thing, but I've been able to kind of see how the bureau and the department has tried to keep up with it and move along with it as it's rapidly developed. And I think it's been pretty, I guess, more successful than I expected in trying to keep pace with it. Right, the story we have on the outside is that government speed and technology speed are not the same, and there's still probably a gap between those two. But I would say kind of the ability to kind of keep up with those things is higher than I expected. Is it perfect? Nowhere near to it, and there's still lots of inefficiencies in the system that hopefully we can work out. But I would say overall, better than I expected. And I have been saying that of all of the political science that I've read, and it turns out that the bureaucratic politics stuff is the stuff that actually is the clearest and the most useful, and like you see that stuff happening all the time. But the foreign policy theory is less so.
Well, Adam, thank you so much for joining me. This was a great conversation.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me, and we really appreciate you engaging with and promoting this strategy.
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. You can get ad-free versions of this and other Lawfare podcasts by becoming a Lawfare material supporter through our website, lawfaremedia.org/support. You'll also get access to special events and other content available only to our supporters. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Look out for our other podcasts, including Rational Security, Chatter, Allies, and The Aftermath, our latest Lawfare Presents podcast series on the government's response to January 6th. Check out our written work at lawfaremedia.org. The podcast is edited by Jen Patia, and your audio engineer this episode was Kara Schillen of Goat Rodeo. Our theme song is from Alavai Music. As always, thank you for listening.